The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Creek's dusty main street as Cowboy adjusted his weathered hat and spurred his horse toward the general store. At 43, he'd learned that keeping to himself meant staying alive in a town where secrets ran deeper than the nearby creek that gave the settlement its name. His weathered face, marked by years of solitude and hard living, rarely showed emotion, until today. As he rounded the corner near the town square, something made him pull his horse to an abrupt stop. There, beside the freshly constructed gallows that had been erected just 3 days prior, sat a small figure hunched in the dirt. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 years old, his thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to echo off the wooden platform above him. Cowboy had seen plenty of suffering in his time, cattle rustlers meeting their end, families torn apart by drought and disease, men broken by the unforgiving frontier. But something about this child's despair cut through his carefully constructed walls like a hot knife through butter. The boy's clothes were torn and dirty, his dark hair matted with dust, and his small hands clutched something tightly to his chest. "Boy," Cowboy called out, his gravelly voice softer than usual. "What you doing out here all alone?" The child looked up with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. They were the deepest brown Cowboy had ever seen, and in them he recognized something that made his blood run cold. The look of someone who'd been condemned without trial, judged without evidence, and abandoned without mercy. "They say I killed Mr. Henderson," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "They say I'm gonna hang tomorrow." Cowboy dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling against the wooden sidewalk. He'd heard whispers about old Henderson's death. The wealthy ranch owner had been found dead in his study 3 nights ago, a valuable family heirloom missing from his safe. The town had been buzzing with speculation, but Cowboy had paid little attention to the gossip. Now, looking at this terrified child, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought long dead. "What's your name, son?" Cowboy asked, crouching down to the boy's level. "Tommy," the child replied, wiping his nose with a dirty sleeve. "Tommy Morrison. But nobody believes me when I say I didn't do nothing wrong." Cowboy studied the boy's face carefully. In his years of wandering from town to town, he'd developed an instinct for reading people, a skill that had kept him alive more times than he could count. This child wasn't lying. The fear in his eyes wasn't the fear of someone caught in a crime. It was the terror of someone trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. "Where's your family, Tommy?" Cowboy asked gently. Fresh tears spilled down the boy's cheeks. "Ma died last winter from the fever. Pa went looking for work in California 2 months ago. Said he'd send for me when he found something steady." Tommy's voice cracked. "I've been staying with the Hendersons, doing chores for food and a place to sleep in their barn." The pieces of the puzzle began forming in Cowboy's mind. A vulnerable orphan, dependent on the charity of others, would make an easy scapegoat for a crime that had the whole town on edge. He'd seen it before. Communities quick to blame the powerless when fear demanded a culprit. "Tell me what happened that night," Cowboy said, settling himself on the ground beside Tommy. The boy's story came out in broken fragments. He'd been in the barn mending a bridle by lamplight when he heard shouting from the main house. By the time he worked up the courage to investigate, he found Mrs. Henderson screaming over her husband's body. The safe was open, and Henderson's prized gold pocket watch, a family heirloom worth more than most folks in Dry Creek saw in a year, was gone. "Mrs. Henderson," she started pointing at me, saying I was the only other person who knew about that watch. Tommy continued, his small hands trembling. "But I swear on my ma's grave, I never touched nothing that wasn't mine." Cowboy believed him. More than that, he recognized the injustice unfolding before his eyes. In a town desperate for answers, they'd found their convenient villain in a friendless orphan who couldn't defend himself. As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Dalton appeared at the edge of the square, his hand resting on his gun belt. Behind him walked Mayor Blackwood and 3 other prominent townsmen, their faces set in grim determination. "Morrison!" Sheriff Dalton called out. "Get away from that killer, Cowboy! Boy's got a date with the rope tomorrow morning." Cowboy stood slowly, placing himself between Tommy and the approaching men. "Sheriff, you mind telling me what evidence you got against this child?" "Evidence?" Mayor Blackwood scoffed, his round face red with indignation. "The boy was the only one with access to Henderson's house. The watch is missing, Henderson's dead, and the kid can't account for his whereabouts when it happened." "That ain't evidence," Cowboy replied calmly. "That's speculation." Sheriff Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You questioning the law in this town, Cowboy?" The tension in the square was thick, enough to cut with a knife. Cowboy could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, staying neutral, keeping his head down. But looking at Tommy's terrified face, he realized some things were worth fighting for. "I'm questioning the rush to judgment," Cowboy said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made the sheriff's hand twitch toward his weapon. "This boy deserves a fair trial, not a lynching." "He had his trial," Mayor Blackwood snapped. "Judge Patterson heard the case yesterday. Guilty as charged." Cowboy's jaw tightened. Judge Patterson was known throughout the territory for his quick verdicts and quicker sentences. The man had probably spent all of 5 minutes reviewing the case before condemning Tommy to death. "I want to see the evidence myself," Cowboy declared, "and I want to talk to anyone who might have seen something that night." Sheriff Dalton laughed harshly. "You got no authority here, Cowboy. You're just a drifter passing through. This ain't your concern." But as Cowboy looked down at Tommy, who was now clinging to his leg like a lifeline, he realized it had become his concern. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. Not gold or land or reputation, but simple justice for a child who had no one else to stand up for him. "Maybe not," Cowboy said quietly, "but I'm making it my concern." The standoff stretched for several tense moments before Sheriff Dalton finally gestured to his men. "Come on, boys. Let the fool waste his time. Won't change nothing. Boy hangs at dawn." As the group walked away, Cowboy knelt beside Tommy again. The child's eyes held a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "You really gonna help me, mister?" Tommy whispered. Cowboy placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm gonna try, son. But I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Every detail, no matter how small." As Tommy began his story again, this time with more confidence, Cowboy's mind was already working. He had less than 24 hours to uncover the truth and save an innocent child's life. The odds were stacked against him. The whole town seemed convinced of Tommy's guilt, and he was just one man against an entire community's thirst for vengeance. But as he listened to the boy's earnest words and saw the trust growing in those dark eyes, Cowboy felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Whatever it took, whatever laws he had to bend or break, he would not let this child die for a crime he didn't commit. The sun climbed higher over Dry Creek, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Time was running out, but Cowboy's resolve had never been stronger. The real investigation was about to begin. The Henderson Ranch sat 2 miles outside Dry Creek, a sprawling property that spoke of wealth and influence in a land where both were hard to come by. Cowboy approached the main house with Tommy riding behind him. the boy's small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Despite Sheriff Dalton's warnings to stay away, Cowboy knew that understanding the crime scene was crucial to proving Tommy's innocence. Mrs. Henderson answered the door herself, her face pale and drawn with grief. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that held a mixture of sorrow and barely contained anger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her gaze falling on Tommy with undisguised hatred. "How dare you bring that murderer back to my home?" "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss," Cowboy said, removing his hat respectfully. "But I believe there's been a terrible mistake. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened that night." Mrs. Henderson's laugh was bitter and sharp. "A mistake? I found my husband dead, and that boy was the only other person on the property. What more do you need to know?" "I need to know about the watch," Cowboy said gently. "Tommy tells me it was valuable. Who else knew about it?" For just a moment, something flickered across Mrs. Henderson's face. A look that Cowboy couldn't quite identify. Fear? Guilt? Before he could analyze it further, her expression hardened again. "Everyone in town knew about that watch," she snapped. "Charles was proud of it. It belonged to his grandfather, worth more than this whole ranch. And now it's gone, stolen by that ungrateful boy we took in out of charity." Cowboy noticed something in her tone, a rehearsed quality that suggested she'd told this story many times. "Ma'am, would you mind showing me where it happened?" Reluctantly, Mrs. Henderson led them to her husband's study. The room was exactly as it had been found. Papers scattered across the desk, the safe standing open, and a dark stain on the carpet where Charles Henderson had breathed his last. Cowboy examined the scene carefully, his experienced eyes taking in details that others might have missed. The safe showed no signs of being forced open. Either the killer had known the combination, or Henderson had opened it himself. The scattered papers appeared to be business documents and correspondence, but Cowboy noticed something odd. Several letters bore the seal of the Territorial Bank in Silver City, and they all seemed to be marked urgent in red ink. "Mrs. Henderson," Cowboy said carefully, "was your husband having any business troubles lately?" The woman's face went white. "What kind of question is that? Charles was a successful rancher. We never had money problems." But Tommy, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "That ain't true, ma'am. I heard Mr. Henderson talking to that banker fellow just last week. He was real upset about something. Said he needed more time to pay back what he owed." Mrs. Henderson whirled on the boy, her eyes blazing. "You little liar! How dare you spread such falsehoods about my husband?" Cowboy held up a hand to calm the situation. "Tommy, you sure about what you heard?" The boy nodded emphatically. "Yes, sir. I was cleaning the windows outside the study. Mr. Henderson was talking to a man in a fancy suit. The man said something about final notice and consequences. Mr. Henderson begged him for another month." This was new information, and Cowboy could see that Mrs. Henderson was growing increasingly agitated. He decided to press further. "Ma'am, these letters from the bank, they look important. Mind if I take a look?" "Absolutely not." Mrs. Henderson snatched the papers from the desk. "Those are private family matters. You have no right to go through my husband's things." Her reaction told Cowboy everything he needed to know. There were secrets in this house, secrets that might have gotten Charles Henderson killed. But before he could pursue the matter further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. Sheriff Dalton rode up with 2 deputies, their faces grim with purpose. Cowboy realized their time was running out faster than he'd hoped. "Cowboy!" the sheriff called out as he dismounted. "I told you to stay away from here. And bringing that boy back to the scene of his crime, that's just plain cruel." "I'm conducting my own investigation," Cowboy replied, stepping out onto the porch with Tommy close behind him. "And I'm finding some interesting inconsistencies in the official story." Sheriff Dalton's hand moved to his gun. "The only thing you're finding is trouble. The boy's been tried and convicted. The execution is set for dawn, and nothing you do is gonna change that. What if I told you Charles Henderson was in serious debt to the Territorial Bank?" Cowboy asked. "What if I told you he was being threatened with foreclosure?" The sheriff's expression didn't change, but Cowboy caught a quick glance between Dalton and Mrs. Henderson. There was something there, some shared knowledge that they didn't want revealed. "Even if that were true," Sheriff Dalton said slowly, "it don't change the facts. The boy was here, the watch is missing, and Henderson's dead. Case closed." But Cowboy wasn't ready to give up. "Sheriff, humor me for a minute. If Henderson was desperate for money and someone knew about that watch, wouldn't that give them motive to kill him for it? Someone who knew the combination to his safe?" "You're grasping at straws," Mrs. Henderson interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. Tommy tugged on Cowboy's sleeve. "Mister, can I tell you something private?" Cowboy knelt down to the boy's level, and Tommy whispered something in his ear that made Cowboy's blood run cold. The child had remembered something crucial, something that could change everything. Standing up slowly, Cowboy looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. "Tommy just told me something very interesting. He says he saw someone leaving the house that night, someone who knew exactly where to find the safe." Mrs. Henderson's face went ashen. "That's impossible. I was the only one here besides Charles and the boy." "That's not what Tommy saw," Cowboy said quietly. "He saw you, Mrs. Henderson. He saw you leaving the house around midnight, carrying something heavy in a cloth bag." The silence that followed was deafening. Sheriff Dalton's hand tightened on his gun, but his eyes were now fixed on Mrs. Henderson with a new intensity. "That's a lie!" she screamed. "The boy's lying to save his own neck." But Cowboy could see the truth written across her face. The grief-stricken widow act was crumbling, revealing something much darker underneath. "Tommy," Cowboy said gently, "tell the sheriff exactly what you told me." The boy's voice was small but clear. "I couldn't sleep that night because of the storm. I was looking out the barn window when I saw Mrs. Henderson come out the back door of the house. She was carrying something heavy, and she looked around real careful-like before heading toward the creek. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think nothing of it till later." Sheriff Dalton was now staring at Mrs. Henderson with growing suspicion. "Martha, is this true?" Mrs. Henderson's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," she cried. "Charles was going to lose everything. The bank was going to take the ranch, our home, everything we'd worked for. He was weak, ready to give up, but I wasn't going to let that happen." The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Cowboy felt a mixture of relief and sadness wash over him. Relief that Tommy would be saved, but sadness that it had come to this. A woman driven to murder by desperation and greed. "So you killed your own husband for a watch?" Sheriff Dalton asked, his voice filled with disgust. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Mrs. Henderson sobbed. "I just wanted to take the watch and sell it, use the money to pay off some of the debt. But Charles caught me opening the safe. He said he was going to turn me in, said I'd disgraced the family name. We fought, and I hit him with the poker from the fireplace. I never meant to kill him." Cowboy placed a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder as the boy began to cry. Not from fear this time, but from relief. The truth was finally out. "And you were going to let an innocent child hang for your crime," Cowboy said, his voice heavy with judgment. Mrs. Henderson couldn't meet his eyes. "I panicked. When I heard Tommy coming to the house, I hid. Then when he found Charles's body and started screaming, I came running and I saw an opportunity." Everyone would believe a desperate orphan would steal and kill for money. No one would suspect a grieving widow. Sheriff Dalton moved forward with his handcuffs. Martha Henderson, you're under arrest for the murder of your husband. As they led Mrs. Henderson away, Cowboy knelt beside Tommy one more time. The boy was still crying, but now there was hope in his tears. "It's over, son," Cowboy said softly. "You're free." But even as he spoke the words, Cowboy knew their troubles were far from over. They had exposed one secret, but in a town like Dry Creek, secrets had a way of multiplying, and he had a feeling that Mrs. Henderson's confession was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous truth. Word of Mrs. Henderson's confession spread through Dry Creek like wildfire, but instead of the relief and celebration Cowboy had expected, the town's reaction was strangely muted. As he walked down Main Street with Tommy the next morning, he noticed the suspicious glances and hushed conversations that followed in their wake. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The first sign of trouble came when they stopped at the general store for supplies. Old Pete, the store owner who had always been friendly enough, refused to serve them. "I don't want no trouble in my store," Pete muttered, not meeting Cowboy's eyes. "You best take your business elsewhere." "What kind of trouble?" Cowboy asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Mrs. Henderson confessed to killing her husband. The boy's innocent." Pete's face was pale with fear. "That ain't what I heard. I heard you forced that confession out of her, threatened her into lying to save the boy's neck." Cowboy felt a chill run down his spine. "Who told you that?" Before Pete could answer, Mayor Blackwood entered the store with two men Cowboy didn't recognize, well-dressed strangers with the look of hired guns about them. "Cowboy," the mayor said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "I think it's time you and the boy moved on. Dry Creek's had enough excitement for 1 week. The boy's been cleared of all charges," Cowboy replied evenly. "He's got every right to stay here." Mayor Blackwood's smile grew colder. "Rights are a funny thing in a frontier town. They tend to depend on what's best for the community as a whole." The threat was clear, but Cowboy wasn't backing down. "And what's best for the community? Letting a child hang for a crime he didn't commit?" "What's best," one of the strangers said, stepping forward, "is maintaining order and stability. Mrs. Henderson was a pillar of this community. Her temporary breakdown doesn't change the fact that someone needs to pay for Charles Henderson's death." Cowboy's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. "You're still planning to hang Tommy." "The boy's a troublemaker," Mayor Blackwood said. "Even if he didn't kill Henderson, he's brought nothing but chaos to our town. Better to clean up the mess and move on." Tommy pressed closer to Cowboy's side, his small hand gripping the man's coat. Cowboy could feel the boy trembling, and his protective instincts flared to life. "Over my dead body," Cowboy said quietly. The second stranger laughed. "That can be arranged." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut, but before violence could erupt, an unexpected voice spoke from the doorway. "I wouldn't be so quick to make threats if I were you." Everyone turned to see Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's physician and one of the few people in Dry Creek who commanded universal respect. She was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be intimidated by hired guns. "Dr. Mitchell," Mayor Blackwood said, his tone becoming more respectful, "this doesn't concern you." "A child's life always concerns me," she replied firmly, "and I have some information that might interest everyone here." She stepped into the store, her medical bag in one hand and a folded paper in the other. "I've just finished examining Charles Henderson's body more thoroughly. The official cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with Mrs. Henderson's confession. Then what's the problem? Mayor Blackwood asked impatiently. Dr. Mitchell's eyes were hard as flint. The problem is that Charles Henderson was poisoned before he was struck. The blow to his head came after he was already dying. The silence that followed was deafening. Cowboy felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Poisoned? He asked. With what? Arsenic, Dr. Mitchell replied. A slow-acting dose that would have killed him within hours. Mrs. Henderson may have struck the final blow, but someone else wanted Charles Henderson dead. Mayor Blackwood's face had gone pale. That's impossible. Martha confessed to everything. Martha confessed to hitting her husband and taking the watch, Dr. Mitchell corrected. She never mentioned poison because she didn't know about it. Someone else was already in the process of murdering Charles Henderson when she walked in on him. Cowboy's mind was racing. Doctor, how long would the poison have taken to work? Based on the concentration in his system, I'd say he was given the arsenic sometime during dinner. He would have started feeling sick within an hour or two, and would have been dead by morning even without the blow to his head. Tommy tugged on Cowboy's sleeve again. Mister, I remember something else about that night. All eyes turned to the boy. What is it, son? Mr. Henderson had dinner with someone that night. I saw them through the dining room window when I was doing my evening chores. It was someone from town, but I couldn't see who because they had their back to me. Did you see them leave? Cowboy asked. Tommy nodded. Yeah, but it was weird. They went out the front door, but then I saw them again later, coming around from the back of the house, like they came back for something. The implications were staggering. Someone had poisoned Charles Henderson during dinner, left to establish an alibi, then returned later to search for something, probably the watch or other valuables. They had arrived to find Mrs. Henderson already there, having killed her husband in a panic over their financial troubles. Who was it, Tommy? Cowboy pressed gently. Did you recognize anything about them? The boy screwed up his face in concentration. They walked funny, like they had a limp. And they wore a fancy coat with shiny buttons. Cowboy looked around the store, studying the faces of everyone present. Mayor Blackwood was sweating despite the cool morning air, and one of the strangers was unconsciously favoring his left leg. Interesting, Dr. Mitchell said, following Cowboy's gaze. You know, Mayor, I've always wondered about that limp of yours. War injury, wasn't it? Mayor Blackwood's face went from pale to red. What are you implying, Doctor? I'm not implying anything, she replied calmly. I'm stating facts. Charles Henderson was poisoned by someone he trusted enough to share a meal with, someone who knew about his financial troubles and his valuable watch, someone who had access to arsenic, which incidentally has been missing from my medical supplies for the past month. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Cowboy remembered the urgent letters from the bank, the mayor's, insistence on a quick execution, and the convenient appearance of hired guns to intimidate anyone who asked too many questions. You killed him, Cowboy said, his voice deadly quiet. You poisoned Charles Henderson, then came back to rob him. But Mrs. Henderson got there first. Mayor Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun, but Cowboy was faster. His Colt was in his hand and pointed at the mayor's chest before the man could clear leather. I wouldn't, Cowboy advised. Doctor, I think you better get Sheriff Dalton down here. I'm afraid that won't be possible, one of the strangers said. Sheriff Dalton met with an unfortunate accident this morning. Fell down the stairs at the jail, broke his neck. The cold-blooded admission sent a chill through the room. Cowboy realized they were dealing with something much larger than a simple murder. This was a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the town's leadership. Let me guess, Cowboy said, keeping his gun trained on the mayor. Henderson found out about some kind of corruption, maybe involving the bank loans or land deals. He was going to expose you, so you decided to silence him permanently. Mayor Blackwood's composure finally cracked. You don't understand the pressures of running a town like this. Charles was going to ruin everything with his conscience and his moral stands. The railroad's coming through next year, and the land values are going to skyrocket. We had deals in place, investors lined up. Henderson's bleeding heart would have cost this town millions. So you killed him for money, Dr. Mitchell said with disgust. I killed him for progress, the mayor shouted. For the future of Dry Creek, and I'll be damned if I let some drifter and an orphan boy destroy everything we've worked for. The mayor's hired guns moved to flank Cowboy, but before they could draw their weapons, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Through the store window, Cowboy could see a group of riders approaching, but these weren't more of the mayor's men. Leading them was a familiar figure that made Cowboy's heart leap with hope. U.S. Marshal Jake Morrison rode into town with a full posse, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him rode 6 federal deputies, all armed and ready for trouble. Looks like the cavalry's arrived, Cowboy said with grim satisfaction. Tommy, I think that might be your father. The boy's eyes went wide as he recognized the lead rider. Pa, I'm here! As Marshal Morrison and his men surrounded the general store, Cowboy kept his gun trained on Mayor Blackwood, while the corrupt officials' hired guns slowly raised their hands in surrender. Marshal, Cowboy called out, I've got a confession of murder and conspiracy for you, and I believe this young man belongs to you. The reunion between father and son would have to wait a few more minutes, but Cowboy could see the joy and relief in both their faces. Justice was finally at hand, and the dark secrets of Dry Creek were about to be exposed to the light of day. Marshal Jake Morrison's arrival transformed the tense standoff in the general store into a scene of swift justice. As federal deputies secured Mayor Blackwood and his hired guns, the marshal embraced his son with tears streaming down his weathered face. Tommy boy, I thought I'd lost you forever, Marshal Morrison whispered, holding his son tight. When I got word about what happened here, I rode straight through for 3 days. Cowboy holstered his weapon and stepped back, giving the family their moment. Dr. Mitchell moved to his side, her expression a mixture of relief and admiration. How did you know to contact the marshal? She asked quietly. I didn't, Cowboy admitted. But I had a feeling this corruption ran deeper than just one murder. Towns don't usually have hired guns hanging around unless there's serious money involved. Marshal Morrison looked up from his reunion with Tommy, his eyes finding Cowboy. You must be the man who saved my boy's life. I can't begin to thank you enough. No thanks necessary, Marshal. Just doing what was right. It was more than that, Dr. Mitchell interjected. This man risked everything to stand up for a child no one else would believe. He defied the entire town to seek justice. Marshal Morrison studied Cowboy with new interest. What's your name, friend? Just call me Cowboy. That's all most folks need to know. Well, Cowboy, I think you deserve to know the whole story. The marshal gestured toward Mayor Blackwood, who was now in handcuffs and glaring at everyone with undisguised hatred. We've been investigating corruption in several frontier towns along the proposed railroad route. Someone's been buying up land cheap by intimidating or eliminating anyone who might drive up the prices. And Charles Henderson was one of those people? Cowboy asked. Exactly. Henderson owned the largest ranch in the area, and he refused to sell at the low prices they were offering. More importantly, he'd figured out the scheme and was planning to expose it to the territorial authorities. Tommy looked up at his father with confusion. Pa, why didn't you come back sooner? I thought you'd forgotten about me. Marshal Morrison's face filled with pain. Son, I was working undercover, trying to gather evidence against these land grabbers. I couldn't risk blowing my cover by coming back too soon. But when I heard you'd been arrested for murder, his voice broke. I should have been here to protect you. It's okay, Pa, Tommy said, his young voice filled with wisdom beyond his years. Cowboy protected me. He never gave up on me, even when everyone else thought I was guilty. The marshal turned to Cowboy again. I owe you a debt I can never repay. If there's anything I can do for you— Cowboy was quiet for a moment, thinking. For years he'd drifted from town to town with no real purpose, no connections, no reason to stay anywhere. But looking at Tommy's grateful face and feeling the warmth of this family's acceptance, he realized something had changed inside him. Actually, Marshal, there might be something, Cowboy said slowly. I've been thinking it might be time to settle down somewhere. Maybe find a place where I can make a real difference. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. Dry Creek is going to need a new sheriff. Someone honest, someone who can't be bought or intimidated, someone who's already proven he'll stand up for what's right. The suggestion hung in the air as Cowboy considered it. A month ago, the idea of taking on such responsibility would have terrified him. But now, with Tommy looking at him with such trust and admiration, it felt like the natural next step. What do you say, Cowboy? Marshal Morrison asked. The job's yours if you want it. The territorial governor owes me a few favors, and I can guarantee you'll have his full backing. Before Cowboy could answer, Tommy tugged on his sleeve. Please say yes, Cowboy. I want you to stay. You're like the big brother I never had. The simple, heartfelt words nearly brought tears to Cowboy's eyes. In saving Tommy, he'd found something he didn't even know he was looking for. A family, a purpose, a place to belong. Well, Cowboy said, a rare smile crossing his weathered features, I reckon Dry Creek could use some honest law enforcement, and someone's got to keep an eye on this young troublemaker. Tommy laughed. The first truly happy sound Cowboy had heard from the boy since they'd met. I ain't no troublemaker. I'm gonna be good, I promise. You better be, Cowboy said with mock sternness, because Sheriff Cowboy doesn't tolerate any nonsense in his town. As the federal deputies led Mayor Blackwood and his accomplices away, the people of Dry Creek began to emerge from their homes and businesses. Word of the mayor's arrest and the revelation of the corruption scheme spread quickly, and soon a crowd had gathered in the town square. Dr. Mitchell addressed the assembled townspeople, explaining everything that had transpired. The shame on their faces was evident as they realized how close they'd come to executing an innocent child, and how their blind trust in corrupt leadership had nearly destroyed their community. We owe this man and this boy an apology, Dr. Mitchell concluded, gesturing toward Cowboy and Tommy. They showed us what real courage looks like, and they saved us from a terrible injustice. One by one, the townspeople approached Cowboy and Tommy, offering their apologies and their thanks. Old Pete from the general store was among the first. His eyes filled with shame. I'm sorry I doubted you, he said to Cowboy, and I'm sorry I turned you away from my store. From now on, anything you need is on the house. Similar offers came from the blacksmith, the hotel owner, and dozens of other residents. Cowboy accepted their apologies graciously, understanding that fear and manipulation had driven their actions more than malice. As the sun began to set over Dry Creek, Cowboy found himself standing on the porch of the sheriff's office, a silver star pinned to his vest. Tommy sat beside him, his legs swinging from the wooden chair, both of them watching the peaceful evening settle over their new home. Cowboy, Tommy said quietly, you think my pa will let me stay here with you sometimes? I mean, when he's not on marshal business? I think that can be arranged, Cowboy replied. In fact, I was hoping you might consider being my deputy. Unofficial-like, of course, at least until you're old enough to make it official. Tommy's face lit up with joy. Really? You mean it? I mean it, son. Every good sheriff needs a partner he can trust, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather have watching my back. Marshal Morrison emerged from the jail, having finished processing the prisoners. Well, Sheriff Cowboy, I think Dry Creek is in good hands. I'll be heading back to the territorial capital tomorrow, but I'll be checking in regularly. We'll be here, Cowboy assured him. And Marshal, Tommy's welcome to visit you any time he wants. A boy should know his father. Thank you, Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, for everything. As the marshal walked away to spend the evening with his son, Cowboy remained on the porch, reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past few days. He'd arrived in Dry Creek as a lonely drifter with no ties and no purpose. Now he was Sheriff Cowboy, protector of a community that had learned the hard way about the importance of justice and compassion. The gallows still stood in the town square, a grim reminder of how close they'd all come to tragedy. Tomorrow, Cowboy decided, he'd organize a work party to tear it down. Dry Creek was going to be a place of second chances and new beginnings, not summary executions and mob justice. Tommy yawned beside him, the exhaustion of the past few days finally catching up with the boy. Cowboy, do you think things will really be different now? Cowboy looked down at the child who had changed his life so completely, and his heart filled with a warmth he'd never experienced before. I think they will, son. I think they will. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cowboy realized that sometimes the most important journeys weren't about where you were going, but about who you chose to travel with along the way. He'd found his family, his purpose, and his home in the most unexpected way, by simply doing what was right when everyone else was willing to look the other way. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more, and Dry Creek would never be the same. Justice had prevailed, redemption had been earned, and a new chapter was beginning for everyone involved. It was, Cowboy reflected with satisfaction, exactly the kind of ending that made all the struggle worthwhile. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, the sound of progress and change coming to their corner of the frontier. But Cowboy wasn't worried about the future anymore. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Tommy would face them together, as family, as partners, and as the guardians of a town that had learned the true meaning of justice. The story of the loner cowboy and the crying boy had become something much greater. A tale of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds that form when good people stand together against injustice. And in the years to come, when folks told stories around campfires and in saloons, they would remember the day that Sheriff Cowboy and his young deputy saved not just one innocent life, but the soul of an entire community. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.